Welcome to A Considerate Life. I'm Dr. Jerome Thomas Bridges. Last time we talked about the photosynthetic Christian life, where we step into the light of God and our souls are nourished and grow and bear the fruit of the Spirit. Today we want to talk about a middle way between flesh and law. Once we've left our life of immorality behind, how do we avoid falling back into those sinful patterns, and how do we step into a religious community or community of believers without being subject to outward religious forms? Now, in order to talk about the middle ground between flesh and law, we want to start by looking at something in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, because his approach to the virtues, I think, will give us a good template for later on talking about the nature of obedience as being a middle ground between law and flesh. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says this: "The present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge, for we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good." And if you watched the first video, we talked a little bit about what we called consideration of theory and consideration of practice. And Aristotle's somewhat getting at that here. He goes on to say, "It is the nature of such things, the virtues, to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and health. Exercise, either excessive or defective, destroys strength, and similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it, that is, health." So this is his idea of the golden mean. He's going to talk about fear and courage. "He who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground becomes a coward, and the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash." So as a graphic, we can look at this. So regarding the emotion of fear, an excess of fear is cowardice, where we don't stand our ground at all. A defect of fear, where absolute fearlessness, is a man who fears nothing. This is the rash person. And so Aristotle says that the virtue of courage actually stands somewhere between cowardice and rashness, and that is, it is the well-governed or the right balance of truly being fearful in a situation, but overcoming fear, the habit of overcoming fear, as we'll see later, in order to do one's duty. He goes on, "Similarly, the man who indulges every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes, in a way, insensible, that is, dull to the senses or not giving in to any sensual desire at all." So, with regard to the pursuit of pleasure, Aristotle is saying the excess is indulgence, and the defect is what he calls insensitivity, whereas temperance, this virtue of temperance, is actually the golden mean between indulgence and insensitivity. It is the proper balanced way of pursuing pleasure. Not too much, not none at all, right? So finally he says this: "Temperance and courage then are destroyed by excess and defect and preserved by the mean. By abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate." We have the virtue of temperance. "By being habituated to despise things that are fearful and to stand our ground against them, we become brave. And it is when we have become so that we shall be able the most able to stand our ground." So for Aristotle, the virtues are habits. When presented with fear, when presented with pleasure, I constantly and habitually do the temperate or courageous thing, and by doing so, I build up the habit of these virtues of temperance and courage. Now, as we move into a more New Testament context, we want to find something like this, some virtue, some Christian virtue with regard to the obedience to God that is between flesh and law. Now, it's obvious that the New Testament condemns a fleshly or a sin nature approach to the passions, and it says this in Romans: "The mind set on the flesh is death," or the sin nature is death. "But the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by the flesh cannot please God. And finally, in Galatians 5, he says this: the deeds of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, envy, drunkenness, and it goes on. Those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And so obviously it is illegitimate for a Christ follower to be a self-indulgent person who just lives out of the sin nature, right? So the flesh is contrary to the spirit. But also in the New Testament, Paul is very clearly adamant that the law or religious duty is also in contrast with the spirit. Now, Paul mentioned earlier the law of God, and we have to make this distinction between the moral law and the religious law. So for the moral law or the law of God, it's in every human heart. It's the basis of conscience. It is the ground of our consciousness of right and wrong, and it transcends time, place, and culture. Whereas religious laws tend to be external duties imposed by a religious hierarchy, and they're often situated in time, place, and a specific culture, right? So many of the religions that are practiced today, you see a type of legalism which is sort of historically bound. It doesn't transcend time and place. So when Paul references God's law, he's typically talking about the moral law. And when he talks about the law, which will come up in the next few verses, he's talking about the religious law code, the Mosaic law code. So he says this in Romans: no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. 2 Corinthians: the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Even to this day, when Moses, the law, is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. He chastises the Galatians. He says, after beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to obtain your goal by human effort? These sort of outward, duty-based practices. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now, there's this modern day legalism that embraces a level of religious duties. There are nearly limitless ways that we can order our lives religiously: what we eat, wear, sing, read, watch, attitudes towards sex, and then the when, where, and how often about all of these things. If we want to live a purely religious life, a life of religious duty, there is no limit to the sort of minutia that religious duty can impose. When Jesus says to the Pharisees, you tithe the tenth of your dill, mint, and cumin, but you leave aside these greater things in the law: justice, mercy, sacrifice. Right? This constant focus on religious duty is the heart of the law and a legalistic mindset. And I'll say this in terms of a mild chastisement: many pastors aid this legalism because they view success as maintaining an outward moral stability in their church community rather than facilitating an individual's growth in the spirit. And when this is done on a large enough scale, at least in a large enough church or a large enough denomination, it looks like normal Christianity, when it in fact is rejected by the New Testament as a way of practicing or following the Christian life. Now the question becomes, how do we obey God? Right? Those who have rightly left behind a life of immorality, they are desiring to come into a relationship through Jesus Christ to God, with God the Father, by the power of the Holy Spirit, and they want to live a life in obedience to God. The danger is that they step out of their life of lawlessness into a life of legalism, because just as much as the flesh corrupts the spiritual life, the law smothers it. So how do we obey God? The answer is to live a life in the Spirit. And a life in the Spirit is what we might call a Christian golden mean, which is why we started with Aristotle in the first place. And it looks something like this. When it comes to the obedience to God, An excess of obedience is something like religious duty. It's the law. A defect or a deficit of obedience is life in the flesh, life lived toward fleshly passions. But the middle way, the Christian middle way, is to pursue a life of the Spirit, a life whereby we accomplish obedience to God, but without the imposition of external religious forms and without giving ourselves over to the sin nature. A defect of obedience is this life of flesh and rebellion. An excess of obedience we might consider the life of law or a legalistic life. By life in the Spirit, we accomplish obedience to God, not by outward performance, but by an inner transformation into the likeness of Jesus Christ. This life is a partnership. It's a partnership whereby we submit ourselves to God, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, we stay aligned with God's will. And Paul says in Galatians 5, against these things, there is no law. Right? So next time, if our souls have been cleansed by the blood of Christ, if we desire to obey God and walk this middle path that is a life in the Spirit, not giving into the passions of the flesh and not allowing the Spirit to be smothered by excess religious duty, as we desire to step into that world of the life in the Spirit, we're going to also step into a community of believers. Now, as human beings, we live our lives in communities, either secular or religious. We live our lives in communities. And when that happens, whether you're in school or at a job or in your church, someone will do something to offend you. And we cannot live in community without being offended. So next time, we'll talk about what does Jesus say about offense and forgiveness. But we're going to start with this quotation from David in Psalm 51. I think it's amazingly provocative. David, who committed adultery with Bathsheba and then engineered the murder of her husband Uriah, says this in Psalm 51, speaking to the Lord. He says, against you and you only have I sinned. So we're going to tie that verse into what Jesus says in the Gospels about being offended and forgiveness. We'll talk about that next time.